Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. The Red Badge of Courage. By Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, first published in 1895, is the narrative of an idealistic young man who comes of age during a devastating Civil War fight. For as long as he can remember, Henry Fleming has wanted to be a hero. To join the army and fight in battles of glory, he can't wait until he's old enough. In his mind, he sees himself returning from battle wounded and ready to tell the world about his heroic exploits. Or he could be killed in battle and leave behind a trail of women who are left to grieve in his wake. The heroic young guy who gave his life for his nation would be a topic of conversation for everyone. Henry wants to say farewell to his mother in a heartfelt way when she eventually allows him to leave. He has all of his lines memorized from a Greek tragedy in his brain. However, his mother treats him like a child when she sends him off, reminding him that she had packed his new socks and that he should behave in a proper manner. His regiment was given special attention as they made their way to Washington. Old men patted him on the back, and the women gave them the nicest food possible. It seemed to him that the old warriors were exaggerating when they talked about their experiences with blood and guts. Dragons were Henry's enemy. After all that, reality struck. Camps were sweltering and filthy. He discovered the age-old military truth of hurry up and wait while eating the bad meal. As soon as the troops arrive at their destination, they take up position and wait for further instructions. Henry's greatest fear is that he may lose his nerve in the heat of battle. He's afraid he'll flee. He was right to be concerned. He does run in the first combat. However, he returns and remains steadfast in his resolve. At the very least, show some bravery. Few young people who enlist in the military have reasonable expectations of what they will get out of the experience. They often fantasize about fame and fortune. They want to put themselves to the test and demonstrate their tenacity and courage. Henry Fleming, even as a child, was no exception. At the bank of a brook, Jim Conklin issues his shirt, which serves as the book's opening scene. When males join the military, one of the first things they learn is how to execute tasks that would traditionally be considered women's work. Conklin returned to the camp after washing his shirt and began spreading a rumor he had heard. Their unit is about to enter combat for the first time. The men's emotions range from excitement to anxiety, but they all had something to say. Henry, on the other hand, felt like an outsider in the boisterous crowd. Henry refused to participate in the men's antics when they witnessed a round private attempting to steal a horse from a dooryard. Even when the girl who lived in the house started chasing him around with a stick, he didn't join in on the encouragement. Even if the man had failed to steal the horse, it didn't matter to him. His thoughts were occupied by memories of his childhood home, which he longed to return to. Henry believes that the only way a man can display his bravery is by engaging in combat. That was the reason he enrolled, over the desires of his mother. Henry was a huge fan of Greek mythology. He was concerned that males had gotten jaded. There was a secular and religious education had erased the throat-grappling urge, or else hard finance held in check the passions. The last time he saw his classmates, they were all crying as he marched out the door. In the spirit of a courageous soldier, he arrives in Washington, D.C., where his troops are gathered. For him, there is nothing better than waking up to the smells of a well-stocked pantry, girls kissing him goodnight, and gentle pats on the back from grandfathers. Henry began to believe he was already a hero because of the attention he and his comrades received at each stop. However, now that the thrill is over, the drudgery of everyday living at camp is dulling some of the luster. He worried while he lay in bed wondering. The conflict was Henry's first time in a setting like this. Erroneously, he was terrified that he would flee. Conklin's response to the man's question about his concern was that he thought they'd follow the others. Run when they run, fight when they fight. Henry was relieved to see that he wasn't the only one concerned about his own bravery. Later, when Wilson had sat down next to him, he inquired as to why he was feeling so low. In light of Wilson's recent complaints about having to walk a lot, the young man inquired as to why he was being cheered so loudly. Wilson stated that he wouldn't mind marching as long as he knew where he was going rather than merely going from point A to point B. Henry asked him whether he was concerned about his bravery throughout the conflict, since Wilson seemed so afraid. Wilson stomps away indignantly, saying that when the time comes, he will do his fair share of battling. Henry comes to the conclusion that he must be a mental outsider because no one else seems to be experiencing the same problems as him. On the move, regiment on the move with each step they took, the men began to question the leadership they had been given so far. Every morning, they started out their day by marching. As the day wore on and the pace of the march sped up, They began to abandon their backpacks and other equipment. They were reducing their herd to the bare essentials in order to feed and hunt. A blue demonstration came to Henry's mind. Henry leads his men up a hill one morning, fully expecting to come face to face with a whole battalion of rebels. But what they saw was a single corpse, with all of his dignity shattered. One by one, they charged at their foe. Henry is carried away by the tide. He knows that if he tripped and fell, the men would trample him to death if he tried to turn around now. He has no doubt that their superiors are sending them to their deaths. The troops, on the other hand, come to a halt. When the authorities begin taking them back over the territory they had already traveled, some of the soldiers construct barriers from which they can fire, but they must remove these barricades the following morning. The morale of the soldiers begins to wane. It is just when they approach that Henry's friend Wilson approaches him. He urges Henry to deliver some letters to Wilson's loved ones because Wilson fears he won't make it through the upcoming battle. After their captain is fatally wounded, the more experienced soldiers rally behind the newcomers to continue the fight. Henry is one of the rookies who is too afraid to speak out against the enemy. Henry has no idea that he is not the first rookie to have this anxiety, and the veterans aren't boxing them in to protect them so much as to prevent them from fleeing. Henry is confident that he will be the fastest runner when the war enters its most harrowing phase. Finally, Henry's troops are hit by the enemy's arrows and bullets. The fighting begins, and Henry joins his brothers. Reloading and reloading are done in the same order each time he loads and fires. There was a striking absence of heroic attitudes among the men who fought around him. It dawned on him that the war stories he'd heard were all lies, and that the truth was a lot darker. As long as the line didn't break, the battle was over. There was jubilation among Henry's men. There was a lot of applause and back-patting. Henry is finally able to take a deep breath after the conflict. It's a beautiful day, with a clear blue sky and green trees. After such a brutal conflict, how could things not be different? Despite the atrocities committed by humans, nature continued to exist. Henry begins to unwind as he realizes that the worst is gone and that he has demonstrated his courage. It appears that all of his comrades are following his lead. The mood immediately changes, however, when word spreads through the ranks that the enemy has re-engaged in battle. Henry has come to the conclusion that the adversary is simply too formidable. Youth saw it as an attack of dragons that were impenetrable. Henry jumped into the fray as he saw other soldiers putting down their weapons and fleeing. One moment his cap and rifle are gone, the next he is in the air, with no idea of where he is going. He sees a general on a horse as he finally slows down. Henry was shocked to find that his troops maintained the line and were victorious despite his belief that the commander is the worst person he's ever met. He became self-pitying as a result of his feelings of shame and remorse. He thinks it was a good idea to flee, since every soldier has the right to self-defense. Henry throws a pine cone at a squirrel as he continues to walk away. As soon as the squirrel runs away from danger, he interprets it as an indication that it is natural to do so. Henry hears a war raging in the distance as he strolls by. He approaches it out of curiosity. He comes across a lengthy line of wounded people as he continues his journey. Henry listens intently as a tattered guy extols the virtues of his fellow soldiers as he collapses next to him. When the ragged man approaches and inquires as to where Henry's wounds are, he quickly turns away and slips through the crowd. Henry grows envious of the other men as they pass, their red badge of courage being the scars they've sustained on their bodies. It all comes crashing down on Henry as he sees that Jim Conklin is strolling alongside him. Jim has been shot and is afraid that he will be trampled by carts if he falls to the ground. Jim is Henry's responsibility, he promises. Jim rejects Henry's offer to let him rest his head on his shoulder. Soon after, Henry was instructed by a stranger to remove Jim from the road. Jim was on the verge of death when the wagons arrived. Jim dashes into the trees while Henry pauses to survey the scene. When Henry tries to catch up with his companion, the man suddenly halts and falls to the ground in death. When Henry looks back and sees the ragged man following them, he immediately returns to the road. The mutilated man is awed by Jim's ability to run despite his injuries. It seems that he, too, is not feeling well. Soup is all the man asks for, and his children depend on him. When Henry inquires as to his own mortality, the man replies that he is not in any danger. Henry, on the other hand, recognizes that the man is dying as he continues to speak. Using another man's name, Henry is asked to show Henry's injuries. His delivery is slurred and muddled. To get away from the man, Henry climbed the fence. He doesn't want to be chastised any longer for not having a wound that would necessitate him being taken off the front lines. Henry notices that the noises of warfare are getting louder as he moves further. He is envious of a company of infantry that are marching into war. Even yet, he still thinks it would have been a good idea for him to leave the battlefield. But if they win, he'll have to find a reason to go home. Henry watches in dismay as the infantry he so admired is slain by the enemy as he tries to concoct an explanation. They've taken to the air. He tries to interrogate the men, but they are moving too quickly for him to catch up. To find out what happened, finally he grabs a man and asks. When Henry begs him to let him go, he gets stomped on the head with the butt of his rifle by the man. A red badge is all he has now. When Henry is able to walk again, he continues on his journey until he meets a kind man who offers to assist him in finding his unit. As Henry and his men say their goodbyes to the stranger who aided them, Henry realizes he never saw the man's face. Countless guys are battling their way back to the camp, including Henry. That he's alive is a relief to everyone. The corporal assumes that the wound is from a musket ball after he has taken care of him. Henry is told to rest by him. When Henry initially wakes up the following morning, he is confused and believes that everyone else in the room has died. Henry, on the other hand, sees his error and grabs the bugle horn. Wilson, a close friend of his, stops by to chat. Henry immediately observes a shift in Wilson's demeanor. He has become more reticent and quiet. After losing half their troops the day before, this group reminisces about the ordeal. A few of the men had gotten loose and joined different units, much like Henry did. He refuses to dispel Wilson's belief that Jim Conklin is still alive and goes on to tell him that he is. Henry recalls that Wilson had handed him a letter, which he had in his possession. Instead of returning it, he decided to keep it for himself. Wilson might ask him further questions about what he did the day before, so he should have it with him just in case. Thinks about his escape and despises all those who fled at the same time as he did. They fled in panic, but he did so with poise. Indeed, he was selected by the gods and destined for glory. He was impervious to harm. Henry was awakened from his slumber by Wilson's request that he return Henry's letter. Now that he has returned it, Henry is once again daydreaming about his stories to tell when he gets home, and about how he would not glorify war. The troop will soon be relocated to relieve another unit in the woods, which will soon be relieved. As Henry grows increasingly frustrated with his superiors, he begins to vent his frustrations, but is quickly silenced when he realizes that someone might bring up his previous flight the day before. Henry erupts with rage as he sees the attackers making their approach towards his squad. Like a rat being hunted by a cat, they're abusing him horribly. His fighting rage is starting to grow in him. In the face of overwhelming odds, he refuses to give up. When the opposition begins to retreat, Henry pursues them, firing continuously. His colleagues finally restrain him, stating there is nothing left to shoot because he has wiped off all of his enemies. As a result, the commander is overjoyed and says Henry would have won the war if there were more like him. Astonished by what he's just witnessed, Henry comes to his senses once his combat frenzy subsides. They discover that one of their soldiers has been wounded during a brief respite in the action. Wilson offers to aid the injured man by going to get some water. Henry jumps at the chance to assist out when canteens need restocking. A vantage point provides a good view of the conflict when they reach the supposed location of the stream, but there was none. Suddenly, they observe a general on horseback nearly trampling a wounded guy to death. Overhearing his next in command, the general speaks to them. He inquires as to the number of soldiers he has available in case a large-scale assault is necessary. As the officer puts it, they fight like miniature mule drivers, hence Henry's squad. I have no choice except to give them to them. The general informs the officer that he should not expect any of his mule drivers to return as he rides away. There is a palpable sense of defeat in the air. Despite their triumphs, they found out that their commanders didn't care about them. The two officers resolve when they return to camp that they would not discuss their thoughts about the general and the other officers. The soldiers advance. The lieutenant twice stops them, but he pushes them onto the battlefield. Henry eventually decides to simply follow the flag in front of him. Running towards the conflict, Henry is drenched and worn out. He soon watches the flag sway and then fall. When they reach the fallen flag bearer, they grab the flag and carry on the fight. Despite this, they realize that their troops are falling back as they keep up their pace. Despite the shouts of the lieutenant, the men are searching for cover in the trees. Henry gets Wilson's banner and tries to rally the troops to fight. As a means of retaliation against the officer who referred to them as mule drivers, he is enraged. Even with all of his urging, he fears it will not happen. His troops are able to put up a good fight in the midst of the conflict. Henry's troops become more enthused as they continue to retake territory from the enemy. The troops are ecstatic until they learn how little progress they've made. They can also hear the officers berating them. Despite this, the colonel commends Henry and Wilson for their bravery in battle. Henry has a fresh sense of purpose as he prepares for the upcoming battle. No matter what occurred, he was determined to keep going. In the midst of the chaos, Henry carries on. This guy is out there battling for the flag. The officer who referred to them as mule drivers sees his dead body on the battlefield. He pictured it as a well-deserved kind of vengeance. After a short time, Henry began to see that his regiment was becoming thinner and thinner. Wilson and the lieutenant were the only two remaining. The lieutenant is riding in the back, pleading with the troops to join him in a full charge. Henry recognizes that moving forward is the only option after a fast calculation. As long as they stay, they will all perish. As long as they retreat, the enemy will be pleased, as well as the haters of the officers and generals. In his turn to the males, he finds that they've all come to the same conclusion. They're on a mission. Henry's regiment is successful when they confront the enemy. The adversary flees, and 4 prisoners are taken in the process. The second flag bearer falls as Henry and Wilson both dive for the opposing flag. Successfully ending the fight is Wilson's task. Henry and Wilson take a little break while receiving new orders. There is a pressing need to return to the river. During his walk, Henry muses over his activities from the previous day. The visage of the tattered guy haunts him to this day, but he has put it all behind him and moves on. He longs for a time after the conflict has ended. A young man with ambitions of glory is now a man with dreams of tranquility, having matured from his youth. Henry Fleming. Henry is a late-teen farm lad. He dreams of glory when he joins the military. Emotion and mood swings range from self-confidence and pride to fear and disdain for oneself. His bravery in battle comes at the cost of an inability to appropriately examine his own motivations, typically vanity or fear, and to judge his own actions. He exaggerates the glory of his adventures. Mistakes are quickly brushed aside, and the blame is shifted to others. To him, his fellow soldiers are beneath him, and he distances himself from them both emotionally and physically. Crane uses the term youth throughout the novel in order to make him an example of all young men who are caught in the grasp of internal and external forces that they are unable to control in the midst of their first war. Jim Conklin, the polar opposite of Henry. He's gotten smarter with time. In addition to his stature, he is a born leader. Jim, in contrast to Henry and Wilson, who are perpetually grouchy, goes about his business quietly. He's a realist who's not afraid to use common sense. He tells Henry that all he needs to do is eat and shoot in order to lessen his load. Asked whether he was afraid of running or fighting, Jim informs Henry that he is aware of the fact that he will flee and fight at the same time as everyone else. When it comes to following orders, Jim is one of those soldiers. He travels for a long time after being wounded and dying with a severe wound to his side. When he dies, Henry yells at the heavens while he goes peacefully. Wilson, a boisterous, impressionable member of Henry's regiment. In order to mask his nervousness, an untested know-it-all brags about his courage. Crane refers to him as the loud soldier for most of the first half of the book. He demonstrates that Henry isn't the only one frightened of death. His youth and sensitivity are on display when he sends Henry a note to deliver to his mother in the event of his death. It is during combat that Wilson goes from being an immature braggart to an unafraid and confident soldier. When Henry flees, Wilson carries on the fight. Wilson cares for Henry's wound and provides him his blanket after he returns from the first battle. Friendship grows between him and Henry in combat as they work together to defeat the enemy. He and Henry are a well-balanced duo in combat. When the Union flag falls, they both go after it, while the Confederates go after theirs. The tattered soldier, Henry meets him while trying to escape the front lines. The victim has been shot twice and is likely to succumb to his injuries. He becomes Henry's conscience after Henry leaves the man in the woods to die in order to conceal his attempted desertion. Henry keeps asking him where his wound is. Henry remembers the tattered man whenever he feels pompous in the rest of the novel. He was an American author and poet, Stephen Crane, 1871 to 1900. He was raised in Newark, New Jersey, and attended Lafayette College and Syracuse University before dropping out to focus on his writing career. Since he was 4 years old, he'd been writing and was published when he was 16. For the sake of becoming a journalist, he relocated to New York. He became a slum reporter and wrote about his plight in his debut novel, Maggie, A Girl on the Streets, 1893. In spite of the high appreciation it received from other authors, the film failed to find an audience. International acclaim came with the publication of The Red Badge of Courage in 1895, his most popular work to date. Crane's descriptions of the Greco-Turkish War, 1897, and the Spanish-American War, 1898, were so realistic that he was quickly sought out by American and foreign newspapers who wanted to hire him as a war correspondent, 1898. In 1896, Crane was shipwrecked while going from the United States to Cuba. His death in 1900 was attributed in part to tuberculosis contracted as a result of his ordeal before being rescued. He wrote about the shipwreck in The Open Boat and Other Stories, a collection of short stories, 1898. Crane retreated to England in 1897, where he scandalized the gossip columns in both the United States and the United Kingdom with his numerous liaisons with married ladies. Stephen Crane met Cora Taylor in 1896, just before he boarded the ship that would almost kill him. They were both 25 years old at the time. In Cuba, they began an affair that lasted the remainder of his life after he returned from the war. His common-law wife declared herself as Cora Crane and remained married to a British military officer. The woman was an American entrepreneur who ran a bordello and a nightclub. Additionally, she was recognized as the first female war correspondent when she accompanied Crane in Cuba. While he lived, C.S. Crane produced a great deal of work. He was an early adopter of the realistic writing style in the United States. In spite of the harshness of his depictions, he exhibits a deep empathy for his characters. With his poetry, Crane was also a pioneer in the use of verse methods. 1895, he published The Black Riders and Other Lines. In 1896, War is Kind and Other Poems, his first full-length collection, 1899. Experimental free poetry can be found in both of these crucial early works. His writings are characterized by their peculiar dialect and setting. His vivid use of language draws the reader into the action and evokes strong feelings in them. Most of his works feature themes of social exile, spirituality, and dread. Stephen Crane, who died at the young age of 28, left a lasting impression on the literary community. Joseph Conrad and Henry James were among his friends. One of the writers of the 20th century who was impacted by his work is Ernest Hemingway. It is widely believed that Crane's work inspired the modernist movement and the imagist movement. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.